I don't know where the title came from, actually. I was looking at it when I was preparing these slides and thinking, that doesn't sound like me. But anyway, you're going to get some insights from cognitive psychology. Right, so to begin with, I'm going to start by giving you some definitions of learning, and we'll talk about how the insights I'm going to offer you connect to these definitions. So here's my first definition, that learning is about these two qualities, retention and transfer. So retention, do students remember stuff that you've taught them? If they don't, that's always disappointing. I don't know if you find that. And then transfer, can they apply what you've taught them in one context, the context perhaps of a classroom, to another one? And again, if they can't do that, that's a shame. So the retention's about durability, how long things last, and transfer is about flexibility. So that's one definition. I don't know, do you like that as a definition? You happy with that? Okay. One consequence to accepting that as a definition, it means that you can no longer say that you can see learning, because I certainly can't see now whether any of you are going to remember anything that I tell you. And I definitely can't see if you're going to be able to use any of it in your places of work. And the same is true as teachers. You can see what people are doing in the here and now. You can't see into the future. So that presents a bit of a conundrum, which we'll explore in the time we've got. My second definition is this, that it's a change in long-term memory. That's quite pithy and short. But if learning doesn't involve a change in long-term memory, it isn't learning. It's something, but it's not that. So learning is something that changes over the longer term. So those are the definitions I'm offering you. If you don't like one, maybe you prefer the other. If you don't like either of them, at least you know what I mean when I use the words, but I'm sorry you don't like them. The other thing that I want to bring up at the beginning is a difference, a tension between the concept of learning and performance. So performance is what you can see when you're teaching, when you're lecturing, when students are doing stuff in front of you. You can see what they can do. Anything perceptible with your senses is performance. And as I hinted at earlier, what you can't see is what's going to be what people are going to be able to do elsewhere and later. So performance is a quality of the present, learning is a quality of the future. And so the iceberg there, which I'm afraid to tell you, that picture's an internet fake. Sorry, how would you even go about taking it? I don't know. But the point there is the tip of the iceberg is what you can see going on around you. And what happens in students' minds takes place beneath the surface. You can't observe it directly. You can make inferences about it. You can say you think they're going to remember and be able to use stuff later. But in order to know for sure, you'd have to wait and you'd have to go somewhere else. So one of the things I want to suggest to you is that typical interactions in classrooms lead to teachers feeling pressure, either from themselves or from their students or from someone else, to make your students' performances look as good as possible, for them to perform really, really well in the classroom. And one problem with that is that it leads to something which sometimes psychologists call the illusion of knowledge. And the illusion of knowledge is the idea that we all think we know things that we don't really know. I had this made clear to me some months ago. I went to see a lecture given by the physicist Brian Cox. I don't know if you know the poster boy of British physics. And he was giving this lecture on how the quantum universe reveals itself in our day-to-day lives and how it's important. And I found it fascinating stuff. And I left the lecture full of excitement, and I went home and I was talking to my wife about quantum physics, and she started to drift off a little bit. And eventually she said, I'd been waxing lyrical for some time. Eventually she said, what did Brian Cox actually say? And I said, I don't know, but it was really good. And it wasn't It wasn't until she asked me that it became clear to me that I didn't actually know. And this is something which psychologists have studied. One of their classic experimental setups is where you ask a group of subjects to draw familiar everyday items, things that you would definitely recognise. So, for instance, you'd all have no trouble recognising a bicycle, but could you draw one? And so in this particular study, subjects were given a pre-drawn bicycle frame so that the results weren't conflated with their artistic skills. And they were asked, can you add the pedals and the chain to the pre-drawn bicycle frame? And it turned out that over 70% of people couldn't do that. And if you look at... It's not going anywhere, is it? And the problem is, I think, for most adults, you probably haven't ridden a bicycle recently, and so you've got a vague idea that the pedals are down there somewhere. One of the things they found in this study was that regular cyclists were much, much better at this, and, for good reason. So beware the illusion of knowledge, that students will routinely believe that they know things that they don't actually know. They remember things. They remember some stuff. They remember that they had experiences. They remember that, if you say to them, do you remember last lesson? They will. They remember they were there, and you were there, and a bee came in the room, or whatever it was that happened. They remember all of that. Do they remember the finer points that you were trying to convey? Maybe, maybe not. It's very difficult to know. But the point that I'm making is the stronger their performance at the time, the likelihood is they'll remember that they got the answer right. They'll remember they performed well. But will they be able to do it again unaided? Possibly. Possibly not. And that's something to consider. So the next thing I want to share with you is an idea of a model of how we learn. So I've given you a definition of learning. This is a model of how it works. I say model, it's wrong. This is a massive simplification of human cognition. The basic rule of thumb here, by the way, is that if your brain was simple enough for you to understand, you'd be too simple to understand it. So this is a necessary simplification. But it's a useful model because it allows us to make some meaningful predictions. And so we've got these three elements. The environment, which is external to you. So at the moment, your environment is this room, and it's my voice and the picture I'm showing you. And your working memory, which is the site of consciousness, it's where you do all of your thinking, is where you pay attention to new information. So you're hopefully attending to some of what I'm saying, but you might be being distracted by, whether you need a wee or something like that. That will be also competing for your attention. And typically as adults, we pay attention. We pay attention to about 1% of the environmental data that's up for grabs. We tend to be pretty good as adults at focusing in on what we consider to be most important. And so you're paying attention to some of the things that I'm saying, hopefully, and that whilst that's happening, you're also remembering things. So you might well have had the experience already that as I've said something, it's prompted you to go, oh, that's a bit like... Or I wonder if this connects with something else I already know. And you're churning together new information with old information, and the result of that churn gets stored in your long-term memory. And long-term memory isn't something you can peer directly into. All your thinking takes place within working memory. We know it must exist, or something like it must exist, because you can think about something, stop thinking about it, and then think about it again a bit later. And it must go somewhere when you're not thinking about it. And that's what, over the centuries, we've come to think of as memory. So within your long-term memory, stuff gets stored, and you'll never run out of space, basically. It's the capacity of your long-term memory is, to all essential purposes, infinite. But that doesn't necessarily mean you can remember when you want to everything that you know. Our ability to recall information that we know is based on environmental prompts. So if I say, If I say bread, you say... Oh, there's a bit of nervous muttering there. I heard a few butters. Obviously, maybe some of you haven't heard of bread, so obviously that would be difficult. Maybe some of you just didn't want to say. Maybe bread prompted something embarrassing. I don't know. But something semantically linked to bread will have popped into your mind. Probably wasn't there before. But because you got an environmental prompt which linked to something you already knew, you couldn't really help yourself. You thought about the thing. And so the information that's stored there in your long-term memory, we think, and this is a theory, as I say, we can't peer directly into anyone's long-term memory, we think that it has this property of organising itself without us being aware of how that organisation takes place. So that when you know one thing, it's very difficult to remember one thing which you know which is unrelated to anything else. So if I were to say a phrase from a foreign language that you didn't know anything else, so for instance, if I gave you a phrase from Mandarin and you didn't recognise it, let's say some of you will recognise this, the phrase ni hao. Some of you know that. Anyone not know that? Okay. So if you don't know ni hao, that second green dot represents what ni hao means in English. So what we're going to do now, for those of you that know what ni hao means, there is a link between ni hao and what it means in English, a virtual line drawn between its English meaning and the sound in Mandarin. For those of you that didn't recognise that there is no line, but what I'm going to do right now, live, is draw a line in your brain between ni hao and it's excited. So ni hao means hello. And you already knew the English word hello, and now a link has been established between those two things. If I carried on, I'm not going to do this by the way, if I carried on trying to teach you Mandarin, all of that information would be increasingly interconnected. And the insight here is that the more Mandarin vocabulary that you know, the easier it is for you to remember all the Mandarin vocabulary you know. Until the point where if you practiced enough, if you learnt enough, you'd become fluent. And when you're fluent in a language, then you can talk without conscious involvement. You can speak without conscious oversight. I'm going to assume that you're all at least fluent in English. And if that's the case, you'll probably have had an experience like this. So it was my birthday recently, and some people were very kind enough to say to me on my birthday, happy birthday. And on at least two occasions when someone said happy birthday to me, I found myself saying, thanks, you too. But it wasn't their birthday. And there was a slight awkward moment where we sort of appraised the fact that I hadn't really been listening. Have you ever had that sort of thing? So you speak on autopilot without conscious thought. And even at a broader level, so at the moment I'm talking to you, I'm not thinking about what I'm saying, I'm just speaking. I'm not sort of selecting words. I'm concentrating on the meaning I want to convey. And because you're fluent in English, you're not trying to sort through all the individual words and going, what do they mean? You're just concentrating on the meaning. You're ignoring the words themselves to a degree. Does that make sense to you? So the more you know about something, the more automatized it becomes, the easier it becomes for you to access it, the less conscious oversight that's required, the less space it takes up in your working memory, the more efficient and effective you become. We're going to come back to that. So based on that idea, I want to tell you some things about the importance of knowing stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a quick little activity to do. I'm going to get you to do a classic test of working memory, and where I show you where you have something to do for which you have no prior knowledge, and you might well find it challenging. But then we'll repeat the exercise, and you will know things that are relevant, and you'll find it much, much easier, and you'll hopefully will demonstrate the importance of knowing stuff. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a sequence of 12 numbers, and I'm going to show you them for 5 seconds. And your job, if you can be bothered, is to try and memorise the numbers. Are you up for this? Okay, it's 5 seconds of your life. Don't worry. If you don't want to do it, just sit there quietly and pretend it's not happening. 5 seconds starting now. Okay. Has anyone done that? Yeah? Does anyone want to? Sounds pretty good. Some of you have certainly come close, but here it is. Now, I'm not going to ask anyone to expose themselves, literally or metaphorically, but was there anyone who struggled with that? Yeah, a few of you. And was there anyone who just couldn't be bothered? Yeah, okay. So it's achievable, it's possible, but it is challenging, and it takes effort and concentration and probably repetition, and you keep it fresh in your mind, and that makes it a little bit easier. What we're going to do now is we're going to repeat the exercise. I'm going to show you the same 12 numbers, but in a slightly different sequence. This time, you're not going to struggle. Because you recognise the dates, don't you? You can't, if you've been educated in England, you can't hear 1066 without seeing some poor fella being shot in the face. And 1812, you can probably hear some cannon fire and maybe a particular piece of music. In 1966, something happened to do with sport. Something like that, I don't know. But it becomes easy, it becomes trivial, and the difference between the two tasks is what you know, what you've stored in your long-term memory. If you know the correct stuff, performing the task becomes easy. If you don't, it's an effort. And this is the case for the students that you're working with. Some of them know more than others, and therefore they find whatever you're asking them to do easier. Some of them know less, therefore they find the tasks harder. Also, here's another insight that I want to suggest to you, is that what you know determines how you're able to perceive the world. So I'm going to flash up an image now for a few seconds, and my expectation is that some of you will see this image and immediately be able to sort of discuss it in quite a lot of detail and know exactly what it's representing, and some of you might be a little bit confused. Let's have a quick look at the image. Anyone want to say what it is? It's something particular about the offsides? Some strategy that a defensive team would employ? It's the offside trap. Now, did anyone not recognise that was the offside trap? If you don't know what the offside trap is, you cannot see it. You can only see it if you know what it is. And so one of the things that, whatever stimulus, whatever thing you put in front of your students, they're all looking at the same thing, but depending on what their prior knowledge is, they'll be receiving very, very different things. You're all now looking at the same image, but some of you are able to see more deeply than others. Probably most of you are able to recognise this as a football schematic, but it's not difficult to imagine someone that wouldn't be able to do that wouldn't possess even that small amount of knowledge that enables you to recognise it as such. So knowing stuff matters. Knowing stuff makes things easier. And so with that as a building block, I want to suggest to you a way of thinking about teaching and instruction and learning which I might have some value for you. And I want to suggest that different things work best depending on when and where you do them. So my suggestion is at the beginning of a course, or when you first meet a group of students, the most important thing for them is that they experience some measure of success. If they don't rapidly experience some measure of success, they're likely to want to give up. That's human nature. Very few of us are prepared to struggle on with things where we've never experienced success. And in fact, as successful adults, you're very poor role models on the whole, because you've strategically quit everything you're bad at to concentrate on what you're at least moderately good at. That's the only way to be successful in the modern world, to give stuff up. And so we tend to give stuff up that we're receiving feedback that we're less good at, concentrating on those things that we appear to be better at. And that's a completely rational choice, and it's the same for your students. Some of them will have learned over the course of their lives that they're not good at some stuff, and that's a challenge. So the most important thing, that whatever it is that you're teaching them, that they experience some success through structure, scaffolding, explicit instruction, guidance, whatever it is, but basically helping them to the point that they can't help but be successful. And this is about their performance, about making them feel good. But at some stage, we have to be concerned with the future and with learning. And at some stage, the help and the support that you're giving them needs to be taken away. It needs to be seen as a temporary structure. If you don't take away help and support, then children are merely dependent. Students are merely dependent. Human beings are merely dependent. If they internalise your instruction, what you know, then they start to become independent. They start to internalise this stuff so that they don't need anything outside themselves. And at that stage, their development becomes more about the future, more about being able to retrieve stuff unprompted, more about being able to transfer stuff to new contexts. At the end, when they leave you, this matters. Anything that they haven't internalised might as well have not happened. If they haven't internalised it, it was a waste of everybody's time and effort. They'll leave only with those things they remember. Does that make sense? So, success is really important, and that implies ways of teaching. Struggle is also important. That implies other ways of teaching. When and where that switch over, however gradual it is, happens, might be different for different students, but it's important. So just briefly, some problems with performance, with classrooms where we're obsessed with students' current performance, some problems. We can expend some of our limited cognitive resources on solving problems. We can also use our limited cognitive resources on remembering how to solve problems in the future. We probably can't do both at once, especially if the problems we're solving are difficult. And this is one of the most counterintuitive and troubling findings from the research into this area, is that it's perfectly possible to solve problems and remember little or nothing about how to do it in the future. As an example, I give you the clock in my car. Recently, the clocks changed, didn't they? And most of the clocks in my life are trouble-free. Like my phone sorts itself out. My kitchen clock, I just wind it. The clock in my car is designed by someone with a limited understanding of the stresses and strains that human beings experience. Because what happens, I notice the time's wrong. I sort of randomly lash out at the dashboard in the hope that I'll hit upon the right combination. Eventually, I admit defeat and look in the manual and find, oh, right, press the 14 buttons necessary to reset the time correctly. I successfully solved the problem. 6 months later, nothing. And this can be equally true. The probability is that this is true for students. The more difficult the problems we give them to solve, the less likely they are to learn how to solve them in the future, even if they're successful in the here and now. So another insight on this sort of picaresque journey into cognitive science, and that suggests that the way experts and novices learn is fundamentally different. That experts think differently because they're experts, because of the quantity and the quality of their prior knowledge in their field of expertise. Novices, on average, will always learn best when given clear guidance, step-by-step instruction, and worked examples to see solutions in front of them. Experts, that's not true. Experts learn best when they're given more freedom and asked to think of their own solutions and to explore the world around them to see what they can find. It was interesting listening to the panel earlier talking about coaching, because coaching, to me, suggests itself as very much an expert model of learning. It's likely to be successful with experts who do probably possess the knowledge to be able to find the answers within. But it would be less likely to be successful the more of a novice you are, because you're less likely to have the experience that enables you to find those answers. You're probably going to be more likely to benefit from a much more structured approach where you're given step-by-step processes and explicit, specific guidance as a probability. And the difficulty in the teaching context is that you're an expert and your students are novices. What's likely to be the most beneficial way of learning for you is least likely to benefit your students. So almost a rule of thumb is that can be useful. If it feels good to you, it's probably the wrong thing for your students. And that's something that's worth bearing in mind. There's a whole field of study called expert-induced blindness, which suggests the more expert we become, the less aware we are of what we needed to do to get to our position of expertise. And we start thinking that, that everybody can just copy our current performance. Okay, so really, I've just seen a 2-minute thing. We're going to struggle to get everything in, but unless I go really quickly. So moving on to the idea of struggle. Really quickly, this has got nothing to do with the Icelandic singer. This is a guy called Robert Bjork at UCLA. He says, you don't forget anything, you just can't remember it. Which is difficult to know the difference. But he says that everything in your long-term memory has a retrieval strength and a storage strength. Retrieval strength is what you can remember right now. Storage strength is what you can remember tomorrow. And this is difficult for us. The time we spend improving current performance increases retrieval strength, leads to people looking good and feeling good, but seems to degrade learning over the longer term, makes it harder for people to transfer and retain things that they can do in the here and now. And that's difficult because teaching is something that happens in the present. And it's almost the point that to be a successful teacher, you have to be teaching in the future. You have to be mindful of the future and be less impressed by what's happening in the here and now. One of the insights that Bjork and the various researchers that have worked with him have discovered, and for which they've amassed a considerable and interesting body of evidence, is that forgetting's our ally. That practice, when something is fresh in your mind, tends to be reasonably valueless. But when you've started to forget and you're asked to remember something which is kind of in there, but you have to reach for it, grope for it, dredge for it. It's the act of dredging that builds future storage strength. It leads to stronger future learning. And so we haven't got time to go into them, but the two things that cognitive scientists have spent a lot of time thinking about and researching are these two ideas that come under the heading of desirable difficulties. A desirable difficulty is something which induces struggle but results in success. So failing is just undesirable. Struggle followed by success is desirable. And spacing, which is basically waiting until somebody's forgetting before asking them to go over it again, and testing or retrieval practice, which is rather than reteaching things, asking students to recall what they once knew, are ways to harness the power of forgetting, to discount the illusion of knowledge, to make students aware of their own ignorance. And that can be uncomfortable. And so the more regular it is as part of your classroom practice, the lower stakes you make it. So collecting data is a poor idea if you want to use these kinds of things. The more likely it is to be seen, less likely it is to be seen as threatening, the more likely it is to have the kind of benefits that we want. I hope, and that was very quickly, we've had half an hour, I hope that you found some of that interesting and useful. If you haven't, I'm really sorry. I tried my best. But thanks ever so much for your time and attention. Thank you.